Welcome all. Thank you for joining us today. This is part of a webinar series in a partnership between University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners. We appreciate you being here today. And thanks to Extension for partnering with Rural Partners. My name is Laura Hep-Kessel. I'm the immediate past chair of the Rural Partners Board. Rural Partners is the state's Rural Development Council. We have a volunteer board. We're membership driven, always looking for more folks to get involved. If you have an interest, we'll put our website in the chat so you can check us out, and membership information is online as well as contact information if you have questions. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks again to Extension for partnering with us in this webinar series. Today we're going to hear from Dr. John Jackson. Dr. Jackson's a regular in our series. I think this is the third webinar he's done for us in the last couple of years. He's going to talk to us about the election that we just had a week ago, and some of that analysis and what that means for us, especially in rural Illinois. Just a few housekeeping remarks before we get started. If you registered for the webinar, you will get an email follow-up in the next couple of days with a link to the slide information and the link to the recording in case you want to share this with others or rewatch it. If you did not register for the webinar, but someone shared the login information with you, please make sure you put your email in the chat, and Nancy will make sure you get added to that email when it goes out. If you have any questions, please include those in the chat box. For the most part, we'll hold those questions to the end and let Dr. Jackson get through his presentation, and then we'll start going through the questions. You're welcome to put questions in at any point throughout the presentation, but we'll hold those till the end. If you're having any kind of technical issues, you can comment in the chat box for that as well, and Nancy will try to assist you. I can't think of any other housekeeping things to mention at this time. If you have questions, let us know in the chat, but otherwise we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Laura. I'm always glad to be here with you and with this group. I want to thank Laura and the council for the invitation. This is always a lively group and a good discussion. And as she just indicated, I'll save some time at the end for question and answer. I want to start with just the title, a look back at the 2022 midterm elections. And in that title and in the run-up to it, I promised a discussion of what happened and why, and then a bit of a look ahead toward the next 2 years, and of course the run up to 2024, which is right now on top of us. I can't analyze these questions without setting the context, and the context is deeply impacted by the 2020 presidential election and congressional elections, and what happened then and what happened immediately after, for example, on January the 6th. And that context sets the stage for the 2022 midterms in a way that is really unprecedented for our midterm elections. I don't think of another midterm election in American history where the previous election still hung around and where the major players from the 2020 presidential election were so much still with us, including, of course, the former president. That logo that I put up from The Economist magazine discusses and raises the question of just how polarized we are, and it indicates vividly and graphically, I think, that polarization. As all of you know, we are deeply polarized by race, religion, region, gender, class, ideology, partisanship, and as the poor Lady Liberty on the statue indicates, it is clear that those divisions are so deep that they have come to, in many respects, threaten our democratic system. And that threat certainly was there in 2020, and it certainly hung over from 20 to 22. So you really can't think with any kind of history precedent where you had that much at stake, it seems to me. These are the most unusual midterm elections, I think, certainly in the modern era for American democracy. If we could go now to that second slide, I have laid out the major variables that I think influence the outcome of this particular election. And all of you know some of this, and all of it in real respect, because you know very well, point number one, the rule is the out party, the one that's not in control of the White House, almost always wins. Presidential party almost always loses seats in both the House and Senate. The average since 1972 for first-term presidents is minus 25 for the House and minus 1.2 for the Senate. So really, that alone sets the stage. All the Republicans had to do was to hit the average, and they would have Mitch McConnell back as majority party leader and running the Senate, and Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House. And at the beginning of this campaign, the media, the pundits, the Republican leaders reminded people of this time and time again as though it's inevitable, because it looks pretty close to inevitable. But note that I said almost always, not always. And the not always comes from the fact that there are three exceptions: 2002, George Bush; 1998, Bill Clinton; and 1934, Franklin Roosevelt. But that's not much when you have to go all the way back to 1934 and pick up Roosevelt just to get three exceptions. So briefly, why is this a rule? Political science has looked at a lot of hypotheses here. We've checked this out, and there's no single answer, but the real answer is that conventional wisdom says that this is going to be a referendum on the sitting president. And certainly people act like it's a referendum. Now, you might question, I think, the logic of that and whether that's really rational for just a moment. President's only been in the job for 22 months. He inherited a lot of problems. A lot of his policies are just going into place and haven't had time to have much of an impact yet. He inherited these things that he had to deal with immediately, and many of those haven't gone away. And for example, the number one issue this time everybody understood and talked about was inflation. If you really understand the way the economic process works in this country, you know that there is monetary theory, monetary practice and policy, which is controlled by the Fed and which is by far the most important single variable, certainly this time. There is fiscal policy, which is controlled by the executive branch, but shared with the Congress. And yet the president is responsible for the economy. We all agree on that. We always agree on that. And it sort of feeds into what I call the myth of the omnipotent president, which is a creation of mine, but it means that we think the president's got a lot more power than he really has, most notably in the area of the economy, where the president is really quite limited in terms of the kind of impact he can have. Take, for example, inflation. The president certainly has some role to play in that. On fiscal policy, again, shared with the Congress, but on fiscal policy, the president, of course, was charged with increasing the price and being responsible for the price of gasoline, which was the most notable measure. President did have some small impact on that through releasing the reserves. That was really about the only direct impact he could have on it. Otherwise, OPEC, the oil companies, and Russia really controlled the price of gasoline. Nevertheless, President gets credit and blame for what happens on the economy. The president really also can't control what the Congress does. The Senate was at 50-50, as you all well know. He had to have the vice president to get anything done there on the close calls, and the Democrats only had +5 in the House. But never mind all of that, we still agree that this is treated as a referendum on the president. And no matter what the partisan combinations have been in the past of White House control on the one hand, control for the Congress on the other. We vote like it's a referendum, and most of the time we vote to punish the president. And when we do that, we make him less effective for the next 2 years. Now, at the start of the narrative, let's look at where Joe Biden was standing, and that is we were getting ready for a punch in the nose to Joe Biden because we look at presidential approval rating. There's a very high correlation between presidential approval rating and how the president's party does in the midterm elections. Again, people know that. You may not remember, but Biden started out in the mid-50s in his first year, up to the first 6 months at least of 2020. But by June of 22, Gallup had the president at 41% approve, 58% disapprove. He's, as we call it, underwater by 14 there. You also may remember it went up just a bit in late August and early September when the president got some legislative victories and the Democrats celebrated over that. He bounced back just a little bit. But overall, I'd rely on Real Clear Politics for sort of the good summary of all the polls that are out there. And in August and September, Real Clear Politics averages had the president at 43 approve and 53 disapprove, obviously minus 10. And that's really pretty much where he stayed. He never did move much after that. Just for quick comparative analysis, compared to Trump in 2018, he was at 40% approve. The Republicans lost 40 House seats that year. You probably won't know this and maybe find it a little hard to believe, but Reagan in 1982 was at 42% approve. The Republicans lost 26 House seats that year. How about Democrats? Obama in 2010 was at 45. Democrats lost 63 House seats that particular year. Bill Clinton in 1994 was at 42. Democrats lost 52. So you can see it was shaping up not to be too great a context for Democrats and for Joe Biden. I think the next point people generally don't understand and really appreciate the importance of, and that's the impact that reapportionment and redistricting and gerrymandering had, setting the stage and setting up the structural context. And that, in short, is it gave the Republicans a significant advantage in the House races. Take a quick look, if we could, at that next slide, slide number 3, I believe we've got it. The census data showed the winners there to be Texas at +2, Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Montana, and Oregon at +1 on congressional seats. The losers were California, New York, we in Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and West Virginia all lost 1, like we did. The reapportionment redistricting process favored the Republicans because the Republicans controlled entirely the redistricting process in 20 states. Those 20 states elected 187 House seats, compared to the Democrats, who controlled only 7 states entirely, and those 7 states elected only 75 seats. Now, we in Illinois are accustomed to the Democrats winning that battle, and the Democrats took good advantage in Illinois of the fact that they were totally in control, and they acted like the party in control always does, and that is they took care of Democrats first, and the Republicans got the leftovers in Illinois. But the differences nationally very heavily are in favor of the Republicans. And in addition to that, the United States Supreme Court intervened in a couple of big cases, most notably New York, and the other was North Carolina. And in both of those cases, they sided with the Republicans. So they just went in with a very excellent position in terms of reapportionment, redistricting, and gerrymandering. Let's take a look at the issues. The economy, I've already indicated, the jobs, the inflation index, all of that, and all of that was certainly going to hurt Joe Biden. Specifically, Gallup had Joe Biden handling of the economy in its August poll at 14% positive, 46% negative. You can't be much worse off than that. This is going to be a referendum on the economy and on inflation. It's clear the Democrats are in a world of hurt at that time. On the other hand, if it had been all about jobs, which it had been for Obama in 2010 and Obama in 2014, where we were trying to dig our way out of the Great Recession of 2009 and 2010, and we were only slowly digging our way out, certainly in 10 and really in 2014, very heavily worked on Obama's position, and Democrats got really clobbered on both of those. Biden could have claimed a good case if anybody was listening to that case. We had somewhat short of 11 million new jobs created on his watch, and unemployment was at 3.5. He kept trying to talk about that, but I must say I don't think he really got the narrative going, and really very little was talk about the jobs. Rather, it was always talk about inflation. And I think that's to some extent because it's so easily measured, and that is when you go to the pump, fill up your gas tank, people know about it. They want to punch somebody in the nose about it. So starting out on issues, that one was the biggie. On the other hand, along comes the U.S. Supreme Court again. In June, they overturned Roe versus Wade, which has been really settled law for almost a half a century. Biden and the Democrats immediately tried to take advantage of the backlash by motivating people that agreed with them, especially the Democratic base and especially women. And it certainly seemed to work at first. It was near the top of the most important problems, say August, first part of September. But then it really didn't seem to stay that much on the top of the list, stayed up close to the top, but not nearly at the top for a while. And people started saying, well, maybe abortion has faded away. On the other hand, there's been some analysis done very quickly by the Brookings Institute right after that. And they found that, number one, women turned out to vote more than men did. And number two, women voted overwhelmingly this time for the Democratic candidates. Now, we've had a gender gap, but this is going to be one of the biggest gender gap years ever. And certainly women are going to play a major role in that return to voting very heavily for the Democratic candidates. Other factors that helped the Democrats and Biden, this again is not the kind of thing most people keep up with, but the fact is the Democrats lost a lot of competitive House seats in 2020. Translation of that is Joe Biden really didn't have very long coattails. In fact, none at all, because he and they lost -12 in the House in 2020 in the competitive, or what we call marginal House districts. So they had already lost a bunch of them. The Republicans had more Senate seats up, however, in 22 than the Democrats did, that is by 20-14. And that left the swing states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Nevada, where the race for the Senate was won and lost. And it turned out, of course, we all know now that it turned out to be mostly a victory for the Democrats in that particular category. It also always comes down to turnout. Which party has the best shot at getting its base excited? The Republicans seem to have the advantage on that for a while, but at the end, it seems like the Democrats caught up. And again, I think really partially based on that Brookings research, that while inflation, crime, and immigration were all good and effective issues, particularly motivate the Republican base, fear for the Democratic norms, pro-choice, voting rights, turned out to also be really important incentives for Democrats to get out for vote, to get out to vote. And then there's the comeback of President Trump. I think this one probably works both ways, but I think overall it undoubtedly worked net to the advantage of the Democrats. Joe Biden kept saying this is a choice, not a referendum. And if you can think about it for a second, it's obvious that's what he wanted people to think. To the extent it became clear that it was a choice between him and Donald Trump, he thought he would be just fine. He used to say, I think fairly often on the campaign trail, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternatives. And so he kept on trying to push that thesis. Trump, I think it oddly enough seemed to be fading from the national narrative and from the news from January through early June of this year. He really wasn't getting much coverage. He wasn't getting out to those rallies, which is where he draws a crowd and a great deal of interest. But then in June and through June, July, and August, there were all kinds of Republican primaries, including ours in Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada also had primaries. And Trump intervened in those very heavily. He recruited the candidates in a number of those. He didn't necessarily recruit those in Illinois, but he certainly made an impact on Mary Miller's race in Congressional District 15, where she won handily over Rodney Davis, that the establishment Republican Party certainly was much in favor of. And he really undoubtedly helped Bailey when he came to town in just outside Quincy, really, what was it, Sunday before Tuesday of that race. But the quality of the candidates that he endorsed did great in the primaries, won probably because of his endorsement. But as you know now, they had very mixed success in the general election. Many of those candidates that were Trump products were easily painted as extremists. Many of them were election deniers, and many of them had little record of public service and very little record in any kind of civic duty that would ordinarily make them likely to be something like a member of Congress, much less a senator. Mitch McConnell talked about that. I'm not sure he really expected to talk about that, but in maybe a fit of peeve one day in front of the cameras, he said, "It is clear that the quality of the candidates matter," when he was talking about why they were having such a tough time. And along came in the first week in March, the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago. That enraged the former president and enraged his base. And they agreed with him that it was an invasion, and all kinds of stuff started happening out there on the internet. And certainly on that side of the equation, it worked for Trump. The January 6th committee was always out there. And as you will remember, they held all of those hearings. Many millions of Americans watched at least some of them. The last one was held in October, and I thought the committee did an effective job of organizing their argument and organizing their case. And I think that began to eat on what was going on in terms of prospects on the Republican side. So you have to have a context, and now we know the outcome. It's certainly going to be the Republicans in the control of the House. We haven't settled that absolutely finally yet, but it will be, I think, without a doubt, the Republicans and Kevin McCarthy, if he can get the votes in the caucus, will be the next speaker. But the notable thing there is how narrow that control will be, not anywhere close to the 20 to 30 House votes that they thought was going to be the margin. It's going to be somewhat around 5 or 6, 7 votes different. And again, as we all know, as a result of Arizona being called over the weekend, Democrats held on to the majority there, but by the narrowest margin possible. It'll be 50-50 from now until December the 8th, when Georgia holds, or well, 50-49, and then on December 8th, Georgia will settle that. If the Democrats pick that up, it will be 51-49. And I think that'll be a big advantage to the Democrats because they won't have to rely on the vice president's vote. And number two, Joe Manchin will be a lot less powerful in the next Senate than he was in the past Senate. So in all of this, the American people were faced with a classic choice we're always faced with. Do we want divided government or do we want unified government? And this time we chose divided government. Although to be sure, it was fairly narrowly divided government. It couldn't be much closer on the Senate side, and really not much closer on the House side as well. So let's move along to the policy implications of that. And I think the most notable word for what's going to happen on policy making is there's probably going to be a great deal of governmental gridlock, legislative gridlock. I think there's a question on sort of the process and the procedural stuff. They've got to find a way to work on things like adopting a budget, which is the most basic thing a government can do. And that's going to be manifest immediately by whether or not they can increase the debt ceiling. You can't get more basic than that. It's essential to protect the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, avoid a government default on our debt. It is the most fundamental thing that we can do, and we've never had a default in the history of the country. But there's going to be a fight over it, and they've already indicated that there's going to be a debate on it. So we'll see that as one of the first markers of whether or not they can get sort of the fundamentals done. There, I think they'll probably most of the time make the Congress work, although it's going to be conflict-ridden. But on the big stuff, I would suggest very little's probably going to get done on what I would list as some of the big ones that are out there and have been out there for quite a long time. I would list voting rights, for example. What are we going to do about the problem of gun violence in this country? What are we going to do about immigration? And particularly there, I would list the Dreamers, because the whole question of what to do about the Dreamers has been around 20 years now. They've worked out solutions time and time again, and yet one caucus or the other in the House particularly wouldn't settle what they had worked out. And most notably, the Republican caucus in the House has been unwilling to do anything about those. Abortion and pro-choice, going to be around, will be debated. With the House, I doubt much will change on it, but it's certainly going to be around. There'll be some more proposals about climate change. The president's off talking about climate change now, but the bill that he got through, I think, will be the legislation that controls most of that issue, even though I think we're going to continue the debate, particularly on how fast to get away from fossil fuels. And that, of course, is the whole debate about energy that to some extent we've been having in Illinois as well, particularly in a coal region. Most importantly, though, is going to be the power of the Congress to provide what's called congressional oversight. That is, they clearly have constitutional right to oversee the executive. They have the right to investigate the executive branch. They have the power to issue subpoenas. They have the power to compel witnesses to come before them and testify under oath. That's exactly what the January 6th committee's been doing. They've been working hard on that. I think the question for them is, can they wrap it up by December the 31st? Because whatever they're doing, they've got to have that report completed and finalized and adopted by December 31st. And if there are any policy implications and recommendations that grow out of that, I doubt they're going to go anywhere in the next House. Speaker to be Kevin McCarthy and others have announced a number of things on their agenda. Speaking of the 6th January committee, they've talked about having their own committee investigate that. And they've explicitly talked about what was Chuck Schumer doing, what was Nancy Pelosi doing, why is this not laid at their feet? And so I expect we may have a rerun on that, although I'm thinking it might not be all that popular. Nevertheless, they've certainly talked like they're going to do it. We all know Hunter Biden's going to be hauled before a congressional hearing. He's going to be the brunt of their investigatory powers, and it's probably going to be a pretty tough passage for him. Some of the Republicans have talked about impeachment for various officials, starting with the president. Marjorie Taylor Greene introduced a bill to impeach Joe Biden the first day of the new Congress when she was just first elected to the new Congress. Others have talked about impeaching others like the Secretary of Homeland Security and the head of the FBI, for example. The only question there will be Biden and at least some Republicans may decide they want to work together in a bipartisan fashion. They want to take on at least some of the issues that they can do something marginally about. And I would point there as an example, the school safety bill that was passed after the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas. There's a bill that's pretty popular and got a bipartisan solution on daylight savings time, which we've of course just passed through, and it's been around for a while, and that might be something they work on. Again, the Dreamers could be on that because there are at least some Republicans have indicated they would like to do something about that. Lindsey Graham talked about recently them doing something about the border that both sides could agree on. Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Elizabeth Warren have a bill to regulate social media. I think if that gets going, it could easily pass because a great number of people are really upset about social media, and Elon Musk hasn't helped that scene very much lately. So the Congress very well might haul him and others up and do something in a bipartisan fashion. I want to underscore my puzzlement here, and that is there was almost nothing talked about regarding Ukraine during the election. The war zone, we're in very close to a shooting war, and yet you heard almost nothing about defense and foreign policy, almost totally absent from the conversation and the narrative. The only thing that came up was Kevin McCarthy, and I believe Mitch McConnell at one time or another said that they would have to take a look at funding for Ukraine and how long they were willing to go along with that. There's nothing more important in the bigger world than what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, what it means for the EU, what it means for NATO and for all of Europe, and really all of the world. And I think it's remarkable and really a commentary on the American people's interest in foreign policy that there was really so little said about what is really a major issue out there. Now, let me shift to another thing I agreed to talk about. I'll summarize where I've just been to say that my prediction is for contentious debate and continued conflict in the Congress and may be conflict that's going to heat up. In fact, I would predict, especially on those hearings, it indeed will heat up when they get going in January. But let's look at rural issues, and I think there the scene is different. In spite of all that conflict that we've been accustomed to and that is coming, I think basic farm programs will be safe. I don't think there will be any significant change in those. For example, you may have forgotten by now, but farmers, I think, mostly haven't forgotten that they did quite all right under President Trump when he got the trade war with China going. He and the Congress, without the Congress in some cases, shoveled billions of dollars in direct payment to American farmers. That's sort of past history, but I think it's relevant history in terms of how bipartisan support for Congress for those price support kinds of programs is there. I don't think there will be anything tinkered with at all. I do think that there may be something that's closely related, and that is an attack on food stamps, because many Republicans have always wanted to reduce the food stamp program. I think there will be heavy support for rural broadband. It's already out there in the infrastructure bill. I think that's a winner for rural areas. And some of you, like Laura, for example, know more about that than I do. But I think that will continue to move along because the money is there and the support on both sides of the aisle is still there. One recently added to the agenda, but the whole growth of electric vehicles and all of that requires and implies, from the building of the vehicles to the making of the batteries. And one thing I think that many people, most people have overlooked is we already have legislation and appropriation for there to be a charging station for electric vehicles every 50 miles for the whole entire United States. That's a huge investment, and particularly a huge investment for rural residents and for the rural areas. And roads, bridges, mass transit, we have both Illinois support for that and federal support for that. And I think that will continue to really provide a lot of jobs and a lot of possibilities in the rural areas, Illinois, wherever you are in terms of rural areas. I think also funding for disaster relief will be re-examined. We've had endless hurricanes, we've had endless floods, we've had tornadoes, and wildfires have become really a part of our existence, all related to question of climate change. I want to shift to Illinois here and J.B. Pritzker's plans and the Illinois General Assembly plans. And I think it's notable at the outset to say J.B. Pritzker and the Democrats ran on their record and ran on J.B. Pritzker's record. First up here will be the Safety Act, as it's called, and that will be the veto session, which is coming in a couple of weeks. There they will go back and clean up some of the language, make some of it more specific with regard to the reasons for holding those who have been accused, whether or not they are a threat to society or another person, for example, on spouse abuse cases, and whether or not they are risk of flight. I think they will continue on the other big areas, for example, Pritzker's budget priorities. They will continue to do what they've been doing and stay the course on that. Particularly important to those of us in the universities is the pension system. They will continue to pay down and rather to pay the required state contribution to our prisons pension systems. And importantly, they've made one down payment, I believe it was $500 million, on paying down some of the deficit there. And there was news yesterday, I believe it was, that the revenue estimates out of the governor's office of management and budget went up I believe it was 3 billion, and some of that will go toward that pay down as well as to the rainy day fund. I think it'll be mostly good news that continues for colleges and universities where we've had our budget stabilized, MAP funding, for example, even an increase to the base recently. And there, I think vocational education is huge and has been for this administration. I think for K through 12, the evidence-based funding formula has got to be funded every year, and I think it will continue to do so. I think staffing and subsidy for rural hospitals is out there and will have to continue. And again, many of you are more accustomed to talking and dealing with that than I am. On the national level, I think the rural areas will be an integral part of that scene as well. And when rural areas prosper in Illinois, Illinois prospers. And likewise, when rural areas prosper in the nation really prospers better. It's not a zero-sum game between rural and urban as it's often presented. I'm coming toward a conclusion, and I want to conclude talking very briefly about divided and unified government. We have just had unified government, both in the state and in the federal government for the last 2 years. And we've just voted for divided government at the national level and for unified government to continue at the state level. But at the state level, we don't have to think very far back to remember divided government. You only have to think about the Rauner era from 2015 to 2018. And that was about as bad a legislative gridlock as I've ever seen. Not a lot got done on the big problems. And as we all know, we couldn't even pass a budget for 2 whole years. And the budget's the most fundamental thing the government has to do, along with public safety at the state level and defense at the national level. And we couldn't get it done. We've had unified government under Pritzker from 2019 or 2020 through 21. We got the budget under control. We just talked about that. We got a whole bunch of new initiatives, particularly the Infrastructure Act of 2019. But of course, the critics would say of that Democrats did a lot of stupid things and overreached, and they would cite the Safety Act of 22, and it worked well for them on people's fear of crime. And the out party, in this case, the Republicans in Illinois, ran very heavily on crime and had at least some success on that. But the governor's going to defend his record as he did during the primary, and we'll continue to see that play out. But I think we in Illinois do demonstrate quite vividly how the difference is between, on the one hand, divided government, and on the other hand, unified government. I think we're going to have a fairly rocky 2 years because we're leading up to 2024. And if things don't get done, the American people are going to get restive, and they're going to get tired of the conflict in Washington, and they're going to tell the pollsters that the country's on the wrong track, which they've been saying again and again, no matter what, for the last several years now, and for actually decades. There is a possible more positive kind of scenario, though, and I want to wind up talking about that just briefly, and that is Biden and the Democrats, and perhaps Mitch McConnell and the Speaker of the House will get together, and they may say the nation really voted against the extremists last Tuesday. They may decide that the firebrands mostly got beaten, and the American people seem not to be voting for conflict and chaos. Now, I would temper that possibility with the observation that the Freedom Caucus is still out there, and they demonstrated yesterday in the vote on Kevin McCarthy that they are going to try to exercise an impact on him just as they did on Paul Ryan and just as they did on John Boehner, both of whom resigned because of the conflicts they were having in the House, particularly with the Freedom Caucus. But it all depends on Congress and who's there, who's got power. My discipline of political science has done tremendous research over the years on public opinion. And one of the things that we point out at the macro level is public opinion is led most of the time by those in office and by the leadership and by opinion leaders. It's not the public getting what they want and what they vote for and think they are in favor of when the pollsters come around. It's what they react to, what's going on at leadership level. We've had a lot of political theater, and we're going to have a lot of investigations, and we've had a lot of constant campaigning, which is probably going to pick up heading toward 2024. But Biden and the Democrats may find some partners among the Republicans. They may find some places that they can work together and compromise. And that's to be much desired because we've got a deeply separation of powers, checks and balances structural system. And checks and balances, structural division won't work, as we've demonstrated time and time again, without compromise. So we've got to have compromise and sort of business as usual in the Congress for any of these problems to get addressed. So the ball's in their court. They've got to decide what they want to look like on both the Democratic and the Republican side. I hope they choose to decide to try to get some things done over the next 2 years. Certainly 2024 is right on top of us, as former President Trump announced last night, which just illustrates where I started 50 minutes ago or whatever. This was an unusual election. 2020 didn't go away, and now 2024 is back, and some of the major characters are the same players that they were in 2020. So that's my prediction. I'll be glad to try to take some questions and defend myself if necessary, Laura.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And I just want to apologize. I didn't do a very good job of introducing you at the beginning.
That's okay.
I know you and your background, but I didn't tell everyone else if they haven't said in our interviews. So
don't worry about it.
Dr. Jackson's been at SIU Carbondale for many decades in various roles. And he's currently at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. He directs the internship program there and edits the Simon Review series, to which he's a frequent contributor. And we really, really appreciate he's willing to partner with us on this regularly. So thank you, Dr. Jackson, for being here.
Thank you.
All right, we had a few comments and questions come in, so I'm just going to start from the beginning, Dr. Jackson. So some of these were early on.
Okay.
I've always been fascinated by the idea that America is all of a sudden so polarized. I think the divisions we see have always existed. We just didn't know about them because not everyone's voice was included in the national discourse.
That's a very good point. We have been polarized in the past, most extremely the Civil War, of course. And there have been other times over the New Deal, for example, over Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, Ronald Reagan returning power to the states and cutting taxes and all that. I think the difference now, though, is the megaphone that not only the media and opinion leaders have, but that everybody who's got a cell phone has, and everybody who's on social media has, and particularly for the young, but for really all of us, we get so much now via social media, and it's all unedited, and some of it's total baloney, and it is terribly influential. I've said to my classes out there on the internet, there's everything from soup to nuts, but a lot more nuts than soup, and I think that's the problem that we face today, and that megaphone makes it different in terms of the polarization and really reinforces the polarization routinely every day.
Someone said, young people turned out in force and climate change is a big issue for them and should be for all of us.
Yes, I think that's interesting and true. And in some ways, I'm surprised that people keep on not totally connecting the misery of the wildfires in the West, for example, the drought that created problems that stretch all the way back almost up to us, and the floods that are now more frequent, and the overrunning downtown Florida cities, just as we saw recently, and all of that. I think it's very much there, but young people seem to be more attuned to that than certainly my generation.
So the next, there's another question, comment, and then someone responded. So I'm going to read all of that, Dr. Jackson, and see if you want to add to it because they're related.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Would you please share your thoughts on who might hold the House whip position should McCarthy gain the gavel? I question McCarthy's ability to manage the factions within the GOP House membership. I wonder if the House whip will wield equal or perhaps greater power than a potential Speaker McCarthy. What impact will this scenario have on the next 2 years? And then someone else said, FYI, House Republicans have held elections. Representative Steve Scalise from Louisiana, I don't know if I said that correctly.
It's Scalise.
Scalise, I'm sorry. Yeah. From Louisiana is now the majority leader, and Representative Tom Emmer from Minnesota is now the majority whip. Kevin McCarthy has been selected as the Republican nominee for Speaker, but will have to get to 218 votes when the entire House votes in January.
Yes, Steve Scalise has been, of course, very close to Kevin McCarthy, and I don't really know the other guy, but I know Steve Scalise is going to be working hand in glove with him. You may remember him from the shooting of the members of Congress. He got wounded in that, but he'll be huge. And Andy Biggs on the other side is going to be leading the charge for the Freedom Caucus, and there's where they're going to have the headaches. He's from Arizona, and that factional strife inside the caucus is going to be really a big problem for McCarthy and Scalise.
We have another question, but if anyone else, any of our attendees, if you have more questions or comments, please go ahead and enter those into the chat. Next question, Dr. Jackson. Can you comment on Trump's legal problems and possible indictments?
Yeah, I think the legal problems will continue, most notably the civil problems. And I think those will go along. Trump organization's already been found guilty and have some things they have to pay for on that side. I think the more important question is the criminal stuff. And I think he's probably pretty effectively squelched much happening, or at least there being anything like indictments coming out by announcing, as he did last night. I think it's going to be a huge headache for the Department of Justice to try to referee that, because they're going to try very, very hard not to be partisan about it or look like they're being partisan about it. And I think that may give them fits, and I'm not clear, but I'm thinking they won't fool around with Donald Trump being a presidential candidate. Anything that's going to happen to him will happen or not happen now, probably after November of 24 as a result of last night's announcement.
What will be the fate of political polling?
Political polling is going to be around. It's a big industry with a lot of jobs, but I think the implication of the question is quite accurate. That is, I've been a pollster. I know a decent amount about the headaches and the problems and challenges of polling are always tough and getting harder all the time. The technical problem with getting a decent sample has gotten harder. Just for example, people won't answer their phone. And if you don't get people that will just answer their phone and let you make your pitch, and the question that's fundamental is that a population, for example, that in 2016 was much more pro-Trump. And is that why the polls went astray? Gallup and the others studied that for 2016 and they thought they fixed it. Along came 2020 and they had another headache and they didn't do great on 2020 either. And part of that is we've always oversold polling in terms of the accuracy and in terms of what people and the media think. And that is, they don't take seriously enough the concept of the margin of error, which is always 3 or 4 or 5. And so if you're within that, that's all you should be promising anyway. But all these races being so close, they could have been absolutely accurate, but within the margin of error. So that undermines the credibility of polling when that's not even something pollsters should have ever claimed they were doing better than plus or minus 3 or 4.
Okay. What are your thoughts on the Georgia Senate runoff in December? With control of the Senate already decided, does that benefit one party or the other?
Oh, that is a very good question. I wish I knew the answer, but you can work up a hypothesis that the Democrats will be more motivated because they're going to want to get that additional vote and they're going to want to have a more workable caucus and to pull the teeth of Sinema and Manchin. And they'll be down there working hard for the incumbent. I think there is Mitch McConnell's interest in and money behind Herschel Walker, but I'm not clear that they'll be able to get that enthusiasm going. Now, in the past, up until 2020, when both Georgia seats were up and Democrats had to win both of them, up until then, Republicans were way better on getting their people, particularly on that runoff. And that would bode ill for the incumbent Senator Democrat now. But 2020 showed the Democrats really stepping up and taking both of those seats. I guess I would give a very modest lean toward the Democrats on that, but without a great deal of confidence on the assertion.
Real quick, Dr. Jackson, I just want everyone to know, I know these webinars normally only go from 12 to 1, but Dr. Jackson's agreed to stay on a little longer. So if you can continue with us, we will stay here for a bit longer. Nancy, if you want to go ahead and put the polling question up, I know we're losing some folks here right at the 1 o'clock hour. I'm seeing folks drop off. So maybe we can go ahead and get the polling question answered and then we'll continue on with questions. Okay, Dr. Jackson. There's been recent legislation on the federal level to bring jobs back to the US. What is your opinion on whether NAFTA and the loss of jobs has led to much of the discontent we seem to have?
I think NAFTA definitely among union people particularly had an impact, and it worked to the detriment of the Democrats, and the Republicans have used it for years. Bill Clinton, of course, led the Democrats to get that done, and they made the case for the global economy, and we have to be competitive in it and so forth. But obviously, we've lost jobs, and NAFTA is a part of that, although trade between Mexico and Canada actually picked up and got considerably better. But on balance, I think it has been controversial, and again, particularly for union members, has been a real detriment for the Democrats. And that whole argument about the global marketplace, it's so complex, people don't understand it. We don't understand why we've had so many supply chain problems, for example. But if you think about it, none of us live anywhere that isn't impacted by Walmart and Target and all those places that are impacted by those kinds of things that we have a feeling of no control over because we don't have much control over them. So it feeds discontent, I think. Okay. But it's fact of life, not going away.
What do you think it will take to stop the shrinkage of Illinois' population?
Actually, Illinois' population didn't shrink, it grew. It on the 2020 first cut, they announced that it was down slightly, and then they went back, and the second look at it, we're above 13 million now for the first time. And so we didn't grow enough that it would have saved our congressional seat, but the fact is we have not net lost population, we've gained. That's one of those factoids that's out there, and most people don't pay attention to the fact that when they went back, and the current population is for the first time over 13 million. But the story stays out there. And, you know, it was a part of the major campaign on what's wrong with Pritzker's administration. So anyway.
We're just throwing out all of the questions to you, Dr. Jackson. So we're just taking you all over the place. Just want you to know. Isn't race a large yet underlying and unspoken issue with the Freedom Caucus types?
Yeah, I think so. The South has always had a race problem, and the country's always had a race problem, but I'm from the South. I'm more familiar with that and up close and personal. Yeah, our racial divisions are very evident in the electoral process, for example, and in lots of other ways as well. And, you know, the Civil War has been over since 1864, and yet we're still fighting the fallout from the Civil War. And race is absolutely one of the top issues in terms of the polarization that I was talking about. And it's something we struggle with every electoral cycle, and it manifests itself for Richard Nixon in the Law and Order campaign of 1968, worked for him, and manifested itself in the governor's race this time.
What will be the impact of Illinois counties passing a referendum to consider seceding from Illinois?
Well, that's a very good question. It's certainly not a moot question, because we had 24 counties that already voted for that referendum item, and Darren Bailey introduced the whole bill in the first place in the General Assembly. It was very much a part of the conversation. As you may know, 3 counties voted on it this time, and all 3 of them passed it. They always pass in the 70-75 margin. They're almost always rural counties, and I explain it 2 ways. Number one, it's absolutely not going to happen from a legal and constitutional perspective. It's just totally pie in the sky, not going to happen, can't be done. Take an act of Congress literally, and the Congress is not going to do it. General Assembly is not going to do it. That being said, it's also an act of what we call symbolic politics, people expressing their dissatisfaction and people blaming Chicago for all of our troubles, which we in the rural areas are terribly wont to do. As you well know, in deep Southern Illinois, it's been a thing to run against Chicago for 50 years that I've been here, and it still works. And I think it's unfortunate, because we really ought to be looking for the stuff that we share and that we are going to be better because Illinois is united, not that we're trying to break the place apart and have people secede from the Union. And we have all too little of that emphasis, both in the state and national level these days, on what unites us rather than what divides us.
Okay. Having skipped Political Science 101, as population increases, does the House total number of members ever change? Illinois lost 2 seats, Colorado gained 2, Montana 1, etc.
It could change. It's been set at 435 now for decades. I've forgotten now how long it's been, but it's back in the turn of the century, of the last century, that it was set there. Practically speaking, it's probably not going to change again, but it could. And so we continue to, first step, reapportion, second step, redistrict, and third step is gerrymander, as I tried to explain. But I think it's just a fact of life that it will continue to change as the census changes, but keep in mind, it's not going to change for the next 10 years. We won't do this again until 2032, whatever. Yeah, 2032, we'll have the next new election on new maps.
Back to the population question, someone said, but didn't rural counties in Illinois lose population?
Most of them did, yes. It continued to be growth in Northeast Illinois, mostly, okay, with some exceptions. The county next door to me is Williamson County. They actually grew some, and they're a rural county, but they've got Marion, and they actually grew. And there are some other cases, but not very many.
Okay. What is your perspective on Amendment 1 that was approved by voters in Illinois? What is the short and long-term impact, and will it increase costs for taxpayers?
Well, I think it was an effort for the General Assembly and the Illinois government to try to provide more protection for the unions. It's anti-right to work state kind of action. I think it illustrates that the unions have made something of a comeback in Illinois. They're not nearly as strong as they were when I moved to this state. And then you had the United Mine Workers, United Auto Workers, steel workers up in Granite City, laborers, all of them were powerful influences, and they lost most of that. We've gone from something like 36 or 38% of the labor forces being unionized to now it's 8 or 9. But under the impact of Supreme Court decision number 1, they've had really major problems, but they are also bouncing back some, and I think this is an illustration of that. And nationwide, places like Starbucks and Amazon trying to get organized, and in some cases being successful, is an indicator that they're making something of a comeback. They're never going to go back to 1/3 of the labor force, but they may have bottomed out and started back up, and this is one indicator that they have.
Okay. Should or could they expand the Supreme Court?
They could. I don't think they will. I don't think there's a prayer of it. I think Franklin Roosevelt, 1936, when he was accused of overreach by the court packing idea going down in flames when he was at the height of his popularity and power. He couldn't get it done. I think Joe Biden indicated he didn't think he could get it done, so just quit. And most people let him quit talking about it at that point. It's going to be a slow process to change the Supreme Court because it's pretty much fixed now, and there are a couple of older people on that court, but most of them were picked by the Federalist Society, by the Republicans, because they were very young, and they're going to be here 2 or 3 decades.
Okay. You had mentioned that social media frenzies are further dividing and polarizing American society. What can we do on an individual level or community level to remedy this tunnel vision, so to speak?
Well, that's certainly a good question. There is a movement that Allie Quick here in town, for example, has joined and working on called media literacy. It's a national movement trying to make people more able to do critical thinking and critical thinking kinds of research, and to find out if the stuff that gets sent to them is really true before they repost it. That would be a step in the right direction. And a lot of it is not worth reposting, but it's easy to repost it. And young people particularly have got to learn that there's a lot of nonsense out there, and it's going to be a real educational challenge, it seems to me. There are people working on it, and certainly serious journalists working on it, but it's a tough slog.
We have exhausted our questions. You've had some great feedback. Thank you for the presentation. It was great. It was exciting. If anyone has any remaining questions, now is your time. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up. Dr. Jackson, is there anything else that comes to mind? I know I was just throwing questions to you. the whole time, but and jumping all over the place just based on the questions coming in. But any last takeaways or thoughts?
Well, I would say that I always like to do these kinds of exchanges, and a webinar with a group like this is a real pleasure because these are folks who keep up, and these are folks who are opinion leaders in their own communities. And we have lots of those kinds of community groups, League of Women Voters, for example, people like that that are really concerned about the quality of our democracy. And I think that was really on the line last Tuesday night. And I think we passed with decent colors in terms of the people that especially failed to get elected in a number of cases. So it's not all bad news out there. I think there are a lot of folks like rural partners that really are conscientious about civic education. So it's a pleasure to be able to visit with all of you.
Thank you. You've got a fan club at Rural Partners. Some of us are on here today.
Well, thanks for asking.
Yes. Thanks again, Dr. Jackson, for being with us. Thanks to Extension once more for partnering with Rural Partners on this webinar series. We will call it quits for today, and we hope you can join us for one in the future. Thank you.